Hi guys, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my own design research trajectory, and hopefully you'll get something out of it and relate it to your own experience being a designer, maker, artist. So I'm going to start off by telling where I'm going and where I have been. One thing that you should know about me is my interest and the skill set in media and design is really diverse. I see the extra space before the D, my apologies. I'm really enthusiastic about everything. I think if you have ever seen Niels and I start talking about something, my brain just goes on fire. And it's really because I'm really interested in where we're going kind of as a society, but I'm also really interested where we're going in design education. I have a crazy kind of background, and so I have a lot of skills in different types of media and design. I've given I've been a lecturer in animation before. I've been a lecturer in graphic design. I've been a lecturer with photography students. I've worked with journalism students, interaction students, product design students, service design students. I also teach not just at Luca, but also in the space and service design program at Thomas More. But my enthusiasm is one of the things that kind of drives me forward in my interest in terms of the role that design can play. Just a little bit about me. I am from that little X on top of the state of Missouri. I'm originally from the States. I lived there until I was 25, and then I moved to Belgium, where I live now. But in between then, I lived in New Zealand, and I taught for 6 years at the Waikato Institute of Technology. I taught graphic design. I was actually the graphic design coordinator there, so I taught all levels of graphic design and prepared students to graduate, obviously, but also master's programs. The reason I use this particular map is, and later I'll talk a little bit about the power of storytelling and visual narratives. And just looking at this particular map, you can see most of the time, certainly I grew up with maps that had the US really in the center of the world. And here we see New Zealand in the center of the world. It's upside down, of course. But the world is arbitrary. The fact that I think in one of the lectures that we had earlier, we heard about this kind of post-colonial mapping of the entire planet. And I think this is a really good example of saying, you know, our view changes based on what we're offered and what becomes our norm. After New Zealand, we came back to Belgium. So I've lived here since 2010, and I've been working at Luca since 2010. I use this particular image because that's a lot of ocean there. And the reason there's a lot of ocean, obviously we don't live on a flat earth. If you are one of those people that believe that we do, I apologize, but you're wrong. The world is round. And so actually, if you could make that flat picture globe, you would actually see that the line that you see drawn so clearly is actually a straight line. Just about me, my background is actually I'm a graphic designer by trade, but since then I actually started out as a graphic artist. That's what it was called when I started. It was just on the cusp of everyone getting a Macintosh, so it was back in the late 90s. And within the capacity of being a designer, I do illustration, I've done branding, I have websites, UI design, publications, interface, editorial design. I've kind of dabbled in all of it, and I really like that process and the kind of freedom that gives. Another hat that I wear is obviously that of a researcher. And one of the key aspects of this is participating with people. And so you can call that human-centered design, you can call it participatory design or design participation. And within that capacity, I develop interfaces, we work on different tools. You can see Niels to my left. In the picture behind. And I've been working with Niels for a long time on dementia, and if you hang out with us long enough, you'll hear us talk a lot about our experience working with marginalized communities like people with dementia. But as a researcher, we create new methodologies. So later on, I talk about what design is and how we use design research. And one of the ways that we use design research is that we look around and we see what other people have done, and then we define what we're doing in relationship to what has been done before. And so we create new methodologies built on existing methodologies, adapting them for the needs or the particular users that we're working with. Next to that, I'm also interested in educational approaches and obviously dimension design. My PhD was actually on designing for one, so working with individuals as a means to kind of design for wider groups. And that's kind of one of my passions as well, is designing for individuals instead of wider user groups. Something I don't do much very often anymore is working as an artist. But for quite a long time, I was doing big kind of typography-based and narrative-based installations. And so I was working with narratives and storytelling, typography, and a lot of stuff in public space. Now that I'm not doing my PhD, I've ended that 3 years ago. Maybe I should pick that up again. So let me make that promise to you. In the next 3 years of your degree, maybe I'll try to do some narrative-based projects here at school. So next to those other two things, I'm actually a lecturer as well, and I already kind of touched on this before. I have a lot of different experience in different kind of areas, probably because I'm so enthusiastic. Sometimes people just say, we need someone to teach us. Who will do it? Andrea will do it. But that's how I've been able to dabble in different kind of dimensions of design, but it also means I've been able to kind of use my skills in new ways. But primarily I used to just teach graphic design, and then I started working in design education, the Educatieve Masters. I worked in interaction design when we had the CMD program. I worked in the play and game design department. I used to teach narrative and storytelling at Hogeschool Zuid in Maastricht. And then now, again, there's an error on the screen. I also teach service design, not storytelling service, but narrative and storytelling and service design. And what service design means is really developing new services and adapting existing services related to the place in which the service will be held, and trying to make the services as inclusive as possible. And finally, the last hat that I wear, which I find is actually really important, is I'm a mom. And so within my capacity as a mother, I'm solutions oriented. I really care. I try to have fun. I try to teach kind of resilience to my children. We like to explore things. I hope that I leave some sort of legacy for them. And I hope I'm a really good example for a human, so that my children always have an example and something to live up to. So I already said that my interest and skill set is diverse, and that existing space before diverse is still there. My apologies. But one of the things that I have a hard time is telling people what I do. Like, people say, "What do you do, Andrea? You're always so excited about things, but what do you do?" And one of the things when I'm talking to students, so guys like you, and when I use the term guy, I mean guys, people in general, so not a gender specific. I mean people. When I'm talking to students, I'm always curious to know how people like you students, explain to other people what you're studying. I think for some people it's really easy to say, I'm a photographer. Oh, you make photographs. I'm a product designer. Oh, make products. It's kind of sketchy. I make films. Like, we always go back to that medium. We go back to that creation process. But when you start working on things like service design, we don't have these labels like we used to. Interaction design. No one really knows what that is. Even the word design is really difficult for people. When Niels and I would go into a care facility doing research, and we would talk to residents that live there, and we would say, oh, we come from the Lucas School of Arts, we're design researchers. Researchers, they kind of understand, they think it's kind of lab coats, they think it might be a little bit medical, psychology, social sciences, not quite sure, but they kind of understand what the idea of research is. But then next at the word design, we just sometimes had to say, we're at the art school. We teach at the art school that's in Genk. So design is one of those kind of fundamental problematic terms that we have to deal with. But back to this idea of when you guys are telling people what you do, you probably refer to things that people know and understand. So for instance, as a graphic designer, I used to say, oh, I make logos. Oh, I can lay out a newspaper. I can make posters. I can make illustrations. And people are like, oh yeah, okay, now I know what you're doing. So like I said, people used to understand what we artists, designers, makers were. Like if you were a textile designer, that's pretty obvious. Textile designers, what did they do? They created textiles. Copywriters created copy. So copy is another word for letters, words. Painters painted things. Architects made structures and buildings. And Ray Eames did everything. So if you don't know who Ray Eames is, you should check her out. She kind of dabbled in product design, but kind of in services as well, kind of looked at objects in this greater whole. In my own experience, design used to be design and research was research, and they were completely isolated from each other. They were really much islands. And so graphic design was dealing with form, processes, techniques. Students, if they were doing research, it was a logbook. Social design was something that we did for organizations and nonprofits, and that's where it's ended. So like a social design project, if we were doing it when I was teaching in New Zealand in graphic design, we would do projects for the animal shelter or the local cultural ballet or, things that were still graphic design based, but really related to the medium, related to graphic design. And then what was research? Well, I was, as a graphic designer, certainly in New Zealand, research was trying to define a way to get graphic design into artistic research practice. So understanding what artistic research practice was, it often meant trying to fit graphic design in a gallery setting. So you can see some of the early artistic work that I showed you before. Next to that was about experimenting with the medium. So that's still valid as well, but it's a limited kind of view on what research is. And for instance, in graphic design, again, exploring the use of narrative and typography. But when we moved back to Belgium, I landed in Lucca, and they had this really completely different view on what design research was. And it was quite novel, but it was kind of carrying on this tradition of still kind of seeking out the boundaries of what design research was. And I started teaching in interaction design, and we weren't just doing interaction design projects. So like in interaction design, you can think of a phone, and we used to look at creating interfaces for it. And that was the design. But what we started doing is actually working with organizations, working with individuals, and actually seeing how the thing that we were creating for them could actually add value to the lives of the people who would use it. So for instance, when we used to do this program with a school in Aachen and a school in Maastricht, as well as Lucca, we worked, for instance, together with the Mondrian Foundation, and it was working with young people with addiction, anger management issues, etc., and creating interfaces, creating tools that would support their therapy. That was quite radically different to what I'd been doing in New Zealand. Next to that, we started working together with people with dementia. So not working with the subject of dementia, but actually going and working with people with dementia. And not only people with dementia, but their carers, their formal caregivers, but also their family members. Some other kind of user groups or communities that we were working with is we worked with school-aged young people with autism. We worked with inside of residential care facilities. We worked with organizations who were supporting people with disabilities or handicaps. And again, also young people with autism. So that was within a design educational setting. So that was all, that blue circle was really about learning to be a designer and using that experience of learning to be as a designer or a maker or an artist in the context of kind of bettering the lives of people with the things that we are creating, the artifacts that we are creating. Now, next to that, one of the things that I was doing around 2010 when I started Lucca, I started doing these projects, so these design research projects. So they were kind of islands of themselves, but they were using the tools that I had in the context of design research. Some examples were a project called Use Well that looked at the impact of design on people and the impact of people on design. We did this project called Adam, or A Touch of Memory, in which we were working with people with dementia as well as the context of people around them. I did a project called Keep Forget, which was archiving the stories of Winterslag and creating artworks in public space that referenced the stories that people had told me individually and were designed to have nalatenschap, so some sort of legacy, to kind of capture the stories and put them somewhere so that other people in the future could create stories based on these existing stories. Another project around dementia was called To Huis, or At Home. And again, we were basing ourselves, we were working from inside a care facility. And another project that I did, more type-based but also narrative-based, was called Keep Delete, in which we are looking at messages that we have and trying to turn them into physical artifacts, but not just choosing random stories, but finding the individual stories for people and creating one-off intimate artifacts that the people could cherish forever. Now, I just said this, but I'm a graphic designer. That's one of the titles that I carry. And what's interesting that none of this is graphic design. You can't necessarily point your finger and say interaction design is graphic design. Working for the Mondrian Foundation was graphic design. Adam was graphic design. No, I use graphic design really as a tool or as a technique to realize some of these other initiatives. What kind of started happening for me, which was really beautiful, and I'm really thankful. I'm really thankful for the opportunities that I've had at Luca to get to this point, is that all these kind of aspects kind of came together, and that place in the middle was really the topic of care. So it wasn't trying to make money. It wasn't necessarily looking at an economic factor. It wasn't really looking at intense experimentation with the medium, but it was really looking at care and how design and care can mutually kind of support each other. What I started seeing is that design could kind of radically change the lives of marginalized people. And what it did was kind of make design a way to be inclusive and relevant. So I think that's kind of one of my spear points. Where am I going with all of this? Well, I think where I'm going is kind of towards kind of the self-evident combination of design, education, research, and then sharing that, and then hopefully the sharing of that or the realizing of some of these projects can create impact in different communities. I want to come back to this as well. This really maybe sounds a little bit abstract, this idea of self-evident combination. For me, it's now self-evident. I'm not going to teach graphic design like I used to teach graphic design back in 2004. Graphic design has changed. The world has changed. We have changed. Design can mean something different. So my vision on design education, or the education that you guys are having, is I really believe we have a responsibility to integrate care, or wider aspect, social design, social relevancy into the fabric of design education. It's really not like if you are sitting behind your screen right now thinking, oh yeah, no, I just want to be a photographer and I'm at school to become to make photos. Yeah, you can do that already. I mean, we all have the ability to make films, to make objects, to make whatever. We have that now. There's thousands of tutorials. So what is the role of education? The role of education is like onderzoekzin, to start hearing new impulses, to sit in a class, not as a queer person, but as a cis person, and hear things about queer theory. To sit in an auditorium and not have anything to do with migration background and hear things about post-colonial structures, and how that has a legacy on how we think and how we live and how we operate. It's not just about woke stuff either, but it's about being kind of informed and learning to be kind of a citizen of the world. That's a bit of a big rant. Of course, part of that is once we achieve that, we are going to have world domination. And I think one of the things, if you really look at where design has come from, we're starting to see it in the interactions research group, is that the humanities, the sciences are starting to say, hey, we need design, and design also needs them. And the reason that we need them is so that we can create a better future, basically. That ties down to one of my favorite things to talk about, which is called responsibility. I don't know why the period is in the middle. It should be up after ability, but I love the word responsibility. I think as designers, makers, artists, we have a responsibility. We have the ability to respond to anything around us. We have the ability to use our voice. We have the ability to share our story, share our position, but we need to do that from an informed position as well. How do we create impact? Well, design methods. So the way that you've been, for instance, in Wilkinson, learning about how to unpack problems. Design methods help us respond to huge problems. There's a term called wicked problems. So these are these kind of huge world problems. It doesn't mean that we're going to come up with the next Google, but it means that we can look at these bigger problems and say, what is our relationship to them? How can we respond to them? How can we respond to this bigger problem of poverty, but at the local level? How can we respond to these bigger problems about accessibility, but at a local level, in the community in which we live, or the community who we want to work for and mean something for? We always have a choice as makers, as designers, about our role within a design, within society. Actually, we have the right to just make advertisements for TV, to make ads that go on buses. We have that right. But I believe certainly within design education, it can be different. Once this kind of becomes your new normal as a designer, maker, artist, you can't just be a designer anymore. So for instance, I said earlier, I used to help students learn to make posters, flyers, websites, interfaces, illustrations, animations, short films, etc., etc. But for me, that's not enough anymore. So once you see the real value of people, once you see the positive impact that you can have on your community, or even at an individual level, I don't think that you can just ignore that. But that's my own kind of theory. One thing that we have to do is we have to define our identity in this changing design space. And ways that you can do that is there's a lot of different kind of terms that are coming. Social design is one of them, strategic design, human-centered design, participatory design, service design, or even queer design. Queering can also mean disrupting the status quo. If you're uncomfortable with that word, queering, I quite like it. I think it sounds kind of risque and contemporary. But the idea of disrupting what is here, not just to disrupt it, but disrupt it in relation to these other elements of social design, trying to create betterment, trying to add value to the world, trying to make people question, is it okay what's happening right now? Is it okay the certain social structures that are in place? Is it okay, to use an example, that e-government solutions are excluding older people, or people that don't understand Dutch, or people that don't have access to stable internet? These are the sort of questions that I believe kind of disrupting the status quo just by asking the right questions and making people aware of them, which is not easy, but that's a discussion for another time. So again, we have to find our own voice in this design space, and that can be a very challenging process. I remember when I used to get students to design their own personal logo. That was the hardest assignment in the 4 years of their degree, was trying to look at their own voice and what voice did they want to put out in the form of a logo. But we have to really see what are the skills that we need in order to bring the human, the context, the reality into our design. Well, I think that's what Onderzoeksen is really all about. Design research is about being engaged. We look around at what other people are doing, what other people are writing. So, for instance, in the project you had to look up academic articles, or looked at magazine articles, looked at web, TED Talks, etc. See what other people are saying or they're making, and you have to say, okay, I've looked at all of this. I formed an informed decision. I have an idea about how this is working, and this is my position within that. So you always define your position, relationship to others, and that's really the strength of design research. Design research is not the artist genius working alone. You can work alone, but it's not just you creating something in isolation. We don't create things in isolation anymore. There is nothing new, okay? Newness comes from knowing what's happening around you and then responding to that with the skills, with the tools that you have as a maker. So as designers, makers, and artists, what do? How do we do this? How do we get that position out to the world? How do we challenge other people with our ideas? Well, we tell stories. I think all of the disciplines that we teach at Lucas School of Arts in Genk, at Campus C Mine, we're about storytelling. And it's not just for the filmmakers, it's not just for the animation people, it's not just for the game designers, it's not just for the photography students, it's for everybody. What else do? We also communicate, okay? We tell people something. We communicate through what we have created. And we also, in that communication, in that storytelling, we share a vision of the future that we want to participate in. Thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at andrea.wilkinson@lucaarts.be. I'm more than happy to sit around and talk about the ideas that you have and in relationship to the medium in which you are working within. And I look forward to seeing your presentations for Onderzoeksen. Thanks.